We are going to go ahead and dismiss the children to Children's Church now. So if you are one of our Children's Church volunteers, please stand up so that the kids can make their way over to you now. And while they are doing that, if you have your Bibles, please turn with me to Acts chapter 23, verses 6 through 11. That is Acts chapter 23, verses 6 through 11. Luke says, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before him. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. This is the word of the Lord. Now, if I could get a quick show of hands, has anybody here ever had a really bad experience with a doctor or some other kind of medical professional? Ever maybe even had a straight up traumatic experience in the medical field? You had a doctor who ignored you, disregarded everything you said, bullied you into expensive treatments that had nothing to do with your sickness, and so forth. Anybody had an experience like that? Me too. I'm about to tell you about one of the most harrowing doctor visits I've ever had. What happened was that I came down with this really gnarly, really painful skin rash. It was the kind of skin rash where if I put any weight on it, it burned like the fires of Hades. You know what I'm talking about? If my clothes so much as rubbed the rash the wrong way, it felt like knives slicing into me. It was a nightmare. So I called my primary care doctor to have it looked at, because my primary care doctor is awesome. If you're looking for one, let me hook you up. But I called my primary care doctor to have it looked at, but the receptionist said, I'm sorry, your doctor's on paternity leave for the next month. And I was like, dumb doctor, had kids. So I hung up and said, I guess I'm going to an urgent care. So I put my clothes on in slow motion to avoid the burning feeling on the rash. And I got into my car and I drove to the urgent care. And I waited in the lobby for like at least 45 minutes. And I was sitting in like the most awkward position imaginable so I wouldn't put any weight on the rash. And finally, I heard somebody call my name and I went to the back. And the urgent care doctor was a lady with a name that sounds like a hilarious combination of cuss words, so I'm not going to use her name here. But she came, kind of looked at me, sort of rolled her eyes and said, come on. So I followed her back to the room and she asked me the usual medical questions with like kind of glazed over eyes and this really disinterested, almost angry tone of voice, and then didn't write anything down. And finally she said, what's your problem? Exactly those words, exactly that tone. I said, for the past several days I've had these like lesions on my legs. I don't know if they're bug bites that got infected or some kind of rash or what, but I wanted to get looked at. And so she kind of sighed, like she was annoyed at having to provide medical care at this medical facility where she worked. She took a look at the lesions for about 10 seconds tops, then came up and said, "That's herpes." I said, can you repeat that? She said, "You have herpes. Those are herpes lesions." I said, "I'm not trying to question your medical expertise, but I know how you generally get herpes." And she cut in. She was like, "And what?" I was like, "Well, I'm married and monogamous, and I have been for years. So is there a possibility this is something else?" And she said, "Let me put it this way. If I went to the mall and I saw my best friend, I would wave because I would recognize my best friend anywhere. In the same way, when I look at your leg, I recognize herpes. I'm looking at herpes." I said, "Okay, well, I was kind of an idiot in high school, so do you think I could have gotten it back then and just not have shown symptoms until now?" And she said, "That's unlikely. If you're showing symptoms now, you'd have to have caught it recently." And I was like, "Okay, but I haven't been with anyone besides my wife in years." And she was like, "Well, that's what everyone says, isn't it?" And then she said, "Well, if you want me to run a test to prove it, I need to scrape off a few of your lesions to run a cell culture." So I said, "Do whatever you need to do." So she grabbed this spoon-shaped scalpel thing. Those of you who work in the medical field might know what I'm talking about. I don't know what it's called, but she proceeded to violently dig every single one of my lesions out to the point that it left a permanent scar, and there are still a bunch of craters on my upper leg to this day where she dug all the lesions out. But when she was finally done, she said, "Okay, the cell culture should take about 2 business days to come back. I'll get back with you when the results are in." 7 days later, after repeatedly calling and getting blown off, I finally got an email. Not even a call, an email. She emailed the results of my herpes test to me like she was emailing me some Kohl's Cash instead of potentially life-changing piece of news. She said, "Your cell culture results came back positive for varicella zoster. Varicella zoster is herpes. Your lesions are herpes." This is early Saturday morning, so Elise isn't even awake yet, and I just went for a long walk and listened to the REM song "Everybody Hurts" for about 3 hours. And then I finally came back home, and it occurred to me that I should Google varicella zoster. So I Googled varicella zoster, and I read every article I could find about it, the first 5 pages on Google, and every single one of those articles said exactly the same thing. They said varicella zoster is more commonly known as, anybody know? Shingles. What I had was shingles. So I wrote back to the urgent care doctor and said, "Everything I've read about varicella zoster says that it's another name for shingles. So do I have herpes or do I have shingles? Is there something I'm just missing or not understanding?" And she wrote back and said, "Shingles is a virus that is closely related to herpes. So I was technically right when I said you have herpes." Don't forget to fill out the customer satisfaction survey at the end. I was like, "Don't worry, I will." So this was the worst doctor visit ever, basically, because every step of the way I was dismissed by this doctor. Every red flag that I raised was ignored by this doctor. Every issue that I pointed out was completely disregarded by this doctor. And I was basically gaslit into thinking I had herpes for a week because she refused to listen to me, because she refused to acknowledge anything I said, because from the time I walked in, she was inexplicably hostile toward me. Maybe I reminded her of somebody who wronged her, way back in the day, so she wanted to knock me down a peg as revenge or something. Maybe she was taken her anger at someone else out on the powerless patient that had just walked in. Maybe she was going through a difficult time in her life and it just leaked out in the form of hostility toward me. But whatever the case, she refused to listen to anything I said because she was visibly hostile from the beginning of the visit. And while most of us have probably never been bullied into thinking you had an STD by a hostile doctor, the reality is that every single one of us should be able to relate to this. Every single one of us will experience some version of this, because my bizarre run-in with this urgent care doctor had nothing to do with religion. It had nothing to do with Christianity. This was not religious persecution. This was just some weird lady with a chip on her shoulder. But our faith will turn people hostile towards us. You know what I'm talking about? As followers of Jesus, we will face hostility from some of the people around us because we live in a culture that is growing increasingly hostile toward our faith. Here's what I'm talking about. Over the past several years, sociologists have started to point out the changing relationship between the Christian faith and American culture. Sociologists who specialize in religion have been sounding the alarm about the kind of sea change in the relationship between the Christian faith and American culture. They divide the history of American attitudes toward Christianity into three stages. The first stage they refer to as positive world. I don't really understand why that's the term, but they call it positive world or positive culture. They argue that from the founding of America until about the early 90s, they disagree a little bit on the exact dating, but from the founding of America until about the early 90s, American society generally held a pretty positive view of Christianity, right? Back during the positive world days, if you were known as an avid churchgoer, people would see you as upstanding, even if they weren't really churchgoers or even Christians, right? Like listing out the church you regularly attended actually improved your chances of getting hired at a lot of workplaces, which is probably unconstitutional, but that's what happened back in the day, right? Being publicly, visibly Christian was a status enhancer because during those days, society had this really intensely positive view of Christianity in general. Experts refer to that as the positive world stage of America's relationship with Christianity. But somewhere in the 80s or early 90s is where they typically place the shift. The culture started to change, right? American culture shifted into the second stage, what sociologists call the neutral world or the neutral culture stage. What happened was that Christianity started to lose its privileged status in society. Being publicly known as a devout Christian stopped being a source of worldly rewards, earthly rewards. It stopped putting you on the faster track in society. American culture began to see Christianity as just one valid option among a bunch of other valid options. It was neither positive nor negative. It was neutral. They call that the neutral world stage of America's relationship with Christianity. But as we moved further into the 2000s and especially the 2010s, the culture started to shift even more. American culture shifted into the third stage, the stage we're in now. It's what sociologists call the negative world, or the negative culture stage, which is exactly what it sounds like. Over the past 15 to 20 years, society's view of Christianity has shifted to being generally negative, right? Being well known as a devout Christian makes you morally suspect in the eyes of a lot of people. When people think about Christianity nowadays, the first thing that comes to mind is bigotry, right? Hatred, judgmentalism. Christianity is seen as an obstacle to creating a better world. Christians are seen as cruel, prejudiced, regressive, backwards, and Christian attitudes, especially Christian attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, gender, and more, are seen as actively dangerous and even evil, right? Over less than 100 years, American culture has gone from seeing the Christian faith as a positive good that should be rewarded and pursued to seeing it as something that should be rejected and ostracized from society. It's gone from holding a privileged status in the culture to being a target of outright hostility. We've gone from having a culture that was favorable toward us to having a culture that is actively hostile toward us. And so the question we have to ask is, what now? Right? How do we deal with living in a culture that is increasingly hostile toward us? How do we respond to a culture that is increasingly hostile toward us? How do we not only survive, but also thrive in a culture that is increasingly hostile toward us? We're going to spend this morning talking about what it looks like to share the truth in a hostile culture. Because as Paul continues addressing the Sanhedrin here in our passage this morning, he's going to model 3 vital principles for sharing the truth of Jesus in a hostile culture. And so let's dive right in. Because the first principle that Paul models for us this morning is the simplest. We should build bridges with the lost wherever we can. Know what I'm talking about? We should build bridges with the lost wherever we can. It's funny, one of the single greatest obstacles that we face in trying to share the good news of Jesus with people is that people don't trust us. Know what I mean? People don't trust Christians. They assume we just want something from them. They assume we just want to use them, that we want to control them, that we just want to force them to live the way we live, think the way we think, and most importantly, give us their money, right? A recent poll found that the majority of Jewish Americans believe that Christians hate them. Did you know that? The majority of Jewish Americans believe that Christians hate them. That is, Americans who practice the Jewish faith. Same poll, a majority of American Muslims believe that Christians hate them. And the overwhelming majority of LGBT plus Americans believe that Christians hate them, and on and on and on. When you add up the numbers, it's actually kind of horrifying. The story that it tells is that a pretty large majority of the non-Christians in the United States believe that Christians actively hate them and want to harm them. I'm going to repeat that real quick. Numerous polls and studies have shown that the majority of the non-Christians in the U.S. believe that you hate them and want to harm them. I'm going to repeat this one last time because I really want this to feel like a knife that's getting jammed in your spine. You're welcome. The majority of the non-Christians in the U.S. believe that you hate them and want to harm them. Now let me ask the obvious question. Is that true? Do you hate non-Christians? Do you want to harm non-Christians? Well, they think you do. So what are you going to do about it? Yeah. As American Christians in 2024, we find ourselves in a situation where the overwhelming majority of people will not listen to us because they literally think we're their enemy, and that means that if we want to share the truth with anyone successfully in our increasingly hostile culture, we have to build bridges with the lost wherever we can. And we see a prime example of what that looks like right here in our passage this morning, because as Paul stands in front of an almost comically hostile Sanhedrin, he realizes exactly how to connect with at least half of them. He reminds the Sanhedrin that he was a lifelong Pharisee. Did you notice that? Paul built bridges with some of the Sanhedrin members by reminding them that he was a lifelong Pharisee. What a lot of people don't know about Paul is that before he became a follower of Jesus, he was a Pharisee. Like all the stories in the Gospels about Pharisees who challenged Jesus, or Pharisees who accused Jesus of committing crimes, Pharisees who opposed Jesus, Paul was one of them. He's not an enemy of the Pharisees. He used to be a Pharisee. And in this moment, as he's standing in front of the Sanhedrin, which was composed of both Pharisees and Sadducees who all opposed and persecuted Christianity, he reminds them that he's not just some guy, he was one of them. He's doing what he can to build bridges with the lost people in front of him. And the crazy part is, it actually works. Did you notice that when I was reading it earlier? It changes the tide of this court procession Paul's in. The entire room was ready to go nail Paul to a cross, but suddenly some of the Pharisees start paying attention. Some of the Pharisees start hearing him out. Some of the Pharisees start to rethink their prejudice toward him. And in the same way, as a people who've been sent out on mission to share the truth of Jesus in our increasingly hostile culture, we are called to build bridges with the lost in whatever way we can. Instead of just silently keeping to yourself while the majority of the lost people in the U.S. go on assuming that you hate them, you should actively try to form connections with them. Instead of just passively letting the lost people in the U.S. go on believing that you want to harm them, you should actively try to find commonalities with them. In other words, the first step in sharing the truth of Jesus in a hostile culture is to put a human face on the truth they've rejected. You know what I'm talking about? To put a human face on the faith they've grown hostile toward. The first step in accomplishing the mission God has given us is for us to become the human face of the Christian faith to the lost people around us. But the only way to do that is to throw ourselves into building bridges with them in whatever way we can. That's the first principle that Paul models for us for sharing the truth in a hostile culture this morning. And the second principle flows naturally from the first. Because as we're building bridges with the lost people around us, we need to listen carefully to learn where they may be open to the truth. You know what I'm talking about? We need to listen carefully to the lost people around us to learn where they may be open to the truth. It's kind of funny. In my experience, most Christians think that lost people have absolutely no interest in religion. You know what I'm talking about? Most Christians think that lost people have absolutely no interest in spirituality, no interest in the Bible, no interest in the question of whether there's a God, whether we can know that God, whether that God cares about us, who that God is, and so forth. Most Christians just assume that lost people don't care about any of this stuff. So they assume that even trying to bring it up will just annoy them, just turn them off immediately, just get them branded as a religious fanatic and a nuisance. But that's not actually true. Now, the really remarkable reality is that there is an open door for the gospel within the heart of every person. You ever thought about it that way? There's an open door for the gospel within the heart of every person because God made us that way. I love the way that Solomon puts it in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, He has planted eternity in the human heart. Listen to that. The Lord has planted eternity in the human heart. The Lord has knitted this longing for eternity into the heart of every person. He's created this built-in desire, not just for this world, but for the spiritual world. He's created us with a built-in desire to know and be known by God. He's given us a desire to worship something. He's given us a desire to transcend the physical world, the material world, the finite world, and grasp something greater, something higher, something infinite, something eternal. He's planted eternity in our hearts. And that means that we naturally have a yearning for the presence of the Lord. And our souls first whisper, and then shout, and then scream at us to follow the breadcrumbs back to the foot of God's throne, which means that there is literally an open door for the gospel within the heart of every person. And all we have to do is find that door and walk through it with one person after another, after another, after another. And we see Paul doing exactly that as he builds bridges with the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin this morning. Because he tries to connect with his fellow Pharisees by appealing to the resurrection of Jesus. You know what I'm talking about? Paul tries to connect with his fellow Pharisees by appealing to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, to understand what Paul is doing here, you have to understand that the Pharisees were defined by their longing, you could say their obsession with the resurrection. In the Old Testament, God revealed through Job that he was going to raise us up in the end. He revealed through David in Psalm 16 that he was going to raise up the Messiah from the grave. And he revealed through the prophets, like the prophet Ezekiel, like the prophet Jeremiah, that he was one day going to raise up all of his people one day because of the covenant that the Messiah would make with us. And the Pharisees were famous for their eagerness to see that day come true. And so in this moment, as Paul is trying to build bridges with the Pharisees here in the Sanhedrin, he says, my fellow Pharisees, the reason I'm standing before you at this trial is because of the hope of the resurrection. He says, the reason I was attacked and arrested and put on trial is because I've been proclaiming the hope of the resurrection. He says, the message I'm here before you proclaiming today is that the Messiah has come and he's been raised up from the grave so that we can rise up too. And I would like to tell you all about it. And that was exactly the right message at exactly the right time for exactly the right people, because on that day, a bunch of the Pharisees from the Sanhedrin saw the light of Jesus for the first time. They realized that Jesus is the Messiah they were waiting for. They realized that his death and resurrection is what God promised long ago when he promised to raise the Messiah from the grave, and that because of Jesus now all of God's people can be raised up from the dead one day. It finally clicked because that was the open door for the gospel that they had. And Paul found it by listening. And then he walked right through it. And that same thing is true for us. There was an open door for the gospel within the heart of every person we meet. But the only way to find it is to listen. The only way to find it is to know them. The only way to find it is to build those connections and find those commonalities and invest in building a relationship with them and then letting those gospel conversations just happen. That's the second principle Paul models for us. We're sharing the truth in a hostile culture. We should listen to lost people to learn where they may be open to the truth. And the third principle flows naturally from the first two. Because even as we build bridges with the lost and learn where they're open to the truth and find the open doors to the gospel and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, we still have to share the truth confidently and let the chips fall wherever they fall. You know what I'm talking about? We should share the truth confidently and let the chips fall wherever they fall. I think one of the things that paralyzes us when we try to share the truth with lost people is that we're worried about how they'll respond, right? We're worried about how they'll react. We're worried about what they'll think of us. Truthfully, we're scared of rejection, right? We're scared of being disliked. We're scared of being thought of as weird. But here's the really frightening reality. Here's the really blunt reality. The truth is going to resonate with some people, but alienate others. You know what I mean? The truth is going to resonate with some people, but it's going to alienate others. And some people are going to hear the good news of Jesus and it's going to grip their hearts and they'll be transformed. Some people are going to hear the message of Jesus and immediately recognize that it's the truth. Some people are going to hear the gospel of Jesus and be filled with joy because it's going to be like finally finding that place they've been homesick for their entire life without even realizing it. But not everybody. Because other people are going to hear the truth and find it offensive. Others are going to hear the message of Jesus and find it ridiculous. Others are going to hear the truth of Jesus and just not care. It's going to soften some hearts and it's going to harden others. It's going to open some hearts and it's going to close others. It's going to resonate with some people but alienate others, and we have no control over how anyone responds. The truth is going to resonate with some people but alienate others. And the difference has entirely to do with where a person's heart is when you reach them. The people who tried to share the gospel with me when I was 15 got laughed in their face. But the guy who spent 2 years working through it with me till I was almost 17 saw me give my life to Christ at the end of it. Because at 15, my heart was hard and rigid and radically opposed to the gospel, but by the time the Lord was done with me at 17, he'd opened my heart and prepared me to accept the truth. And we see the same principle at work as Paul shares the good news with the Sanhedrin this morning. Because as Paul finishes what he's saying, the Pharisees start defending Paul, but the Sadducees try to kill him. Like the Pharisees start defending Paul, but the Sadducees literally become violent. We watch in real time as the message of Jesus resonates with some of the Pharisees, but alienates almost all of the Sadducees. In fact, it alienates the Sadducees so much that they stir up yet another riot. If you're counting, that's 3 riots in a few days. Paul can't catch a break. And they try to tear Paul apart limb by limb. And yet, despite the risk, despite the threat the Sadducees pose to him, Paul shares the truth confidently with the entire Sanhedrin, and then he just lets the chips fall wherever they fall because he knows that the Lord is going to do something with it. And that's exactly what happens. Because as we close out our passage this morning, a group of important Pharisees from the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem turn away from their opposition to the faith and instead discover the truth of Jesus, all because Paul dared to come before them and confidently speak it. All because instead of being combative and bitter because of the persecution they'd laid on him in the weeks leading up to this, Paul came in. He worked to build bridges with them. He listened carefully to learn where they may be open to the truth. And then he shared that truth confidently without worrying about the outcome. And as followers of Jesus, trying to share the truth in an increasingly hostile culture, we are called to do the same. We should share the truth confidently and let the chips fall wherever they fall. So our application for this morning is simple like it always is, but maybe very difficult like it always is. Ask the Lord to give you the courage to share the truth with people who are hostile toward our faith. Ask the Lord to give you a desire to share your faith with others, even in our increasingly hostile culture. Ask the Lord to take away the anger that you may feel because of that hostility. To take away the bitterness that you may hold in response to that hostility. To take away the grudges you may bear as a result of that hostility and to replace all of it with love. Ask the Lord to help you love the people of our hostile culture regardless of the way they treat you because of your faith. Ask Him to give you a desire to build bridges with the people of our hostile culture. Ask Him to help you listen to learn where they may be open to the truth despite their hostility. And ask Him to help you confidently share the truth with them and then let the chips fall wherever they fall. Ask the Lord to give you the courage to share the truth with people who are hostile toward your faith. And then watch how He uses it to transform your life, and then this church, and then our whole surrounding community. Let's join together in prayer. Father, You redeemed us from the pit. You rescued us from our condemnation. You made us into your people, and now you've sent us out to see the same thing happen for others. You have sent us out to go and find the lost and the hurting and the broken and the struggling and introduce them to you. But in this process, we are bound to face hostility. We are bound to face difficulty. We are bound to face people who see us not positively, not even neutrally, but negatively. People who are outright hostile towards us. And yet, you call us not to respond to that hostility with hatred or bitterness, but to respond to that hostility with love. That's hard. And yet, when we respond to the hostility of others with love, we are imitating your love for us. You didn't respond to our sin, our hostility with bitterness. You responded to our sin with love. And now you call us to do the same to others. And when we think about the way that you have rescued us from the pit and now sent us out on your mission, we cannot help but fall down in worship of you. So now be glorified in our grateful worship this morning. And all of God's people said, Amen. If you would now stand as we respond in worship through song together.